Hi there, folks. Welcome to this kind of course opening, brief macro level video lecture about sort of the basics of what we're talking about when we talk about the term ecofuturism. Before I get into the particulars here, I just want to lead with um, something of a disclaimer that in many ways, nothing that I'm going to say in here, especially as it relates to the sort of ecofuturism as writing genre, is set in stone. You are going to have a lot of freedom, both in terms of your conception of this notion of ecofuturism broadly, but also within your own writing to really move in many, many different directions. So, as long as what you feel like what you are writing in some even just minor capacity fits within something related to what I talk about here, you can rest assured that I will certainly consider it as being relevant to the kind of writing we are trying to do. So I'll get into this a little bit more a little bit later in the slideshow, but I want you to all know that there's a lot of freedom here, that the ideas I'm going to go over here are really more just meant to be informative and potentially influential to give you some ways in rather than being sort of fencing you into something very specific. You'll perhaps understand this a little bit more as we go through this slideshow. So let's start by just talking about what basically ecofuturism is. So as the name sort of implies, ecofuturism is anything that examines or imagines the future. That part's pretty easy, as it relates specifically to, as the name implies, ecology. Okay, so as when we talk about ecofuturism as a scientific school of thought, really this is imagining a world where humans are living and thriving alongside the natural world in this kind of like symbiotic balance, right? One is good for the other, as you might imagine, perhaps using your eyeballs and your other senses. Humans don't always operate this way, right? We are often conquerors of nature rather than participants therein. And so ecofuturism wants to think about the ways in which we can coexist essentially as part of the natural world rather than using it destructively. And similarly, when we talk about environmental philosophy, so ecofuturism is a kind of environmental philosophy. The argument behind this philosophy is that human beings should be trying to protect the natural world by removing and decoupling ourselves from the developments that we create that harm that world. So that we should basically not be participating in activities and advancements that do harm. As you can probably imagine, again, we're not particularly good at this. So when we talk about ecofuturist fiction, keeping those ideas in mind is that it is often, but again, not exclusively imaginatively optimistic. So oftentimes, but you're going to certainly see exceptions to this in the reading that we do. The idea is that it imagines a positive future, a world where human beings have accomplished this or have attempted to accomplish this. Um, they are trying to show us what the world could be if human beings have stopped or culled our destructive impulses, especially and particularly as it relates to the natural world, and have turned more toward a sustainable vision. But not all the time. So this is where that you can do whatever you want, where you can move in any direction, happens. So if you write a story that is pessimistic or kind of shows us a failing future or a future that has not thrived, you're not going to get accused of not writing ecofuturism. Okay, so you can certainly take the pessimistic, darker route if and as that feels like something you're interested in, because there are many ecofuturist texts, things that we'll read, things that you may eventually read on your own, that serve as kind of more of a warning. What will happen if we don't change the way that our developments, our technology, and the things that we desire, the wants that we have, affect the environment and ecology. Some of you are certainly familiar with terms like dystopian, utopian, post-apocalyptic fiction. I would say that you could make an argument that dystopian, futuristic fiction or post-apocalypse stories where the world has broken down would be sort of pessimistic ecofuturism, as opposed to your quote-unquote traditional ecofuturism that tries to see the way through. Okay. So then just a few broad suggestions as we get started here. Start thinking about ideas for stories and approaching laying the groundwork for those and brainstorming those. So ecofuturist texts are often combining imaginative science fiction with very real ecology, biology, and those kinds of concerns. So as a result, these texts are often going to require some amount of research on environmental issues, often current technologies, climate trends, ecological trends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then taking that research stuff with your sort of creatively projected or invented technology. Now, this does not mean that you can't do research on the current technology that's in here. As the thing that you're projecting into the future. But oftentimes that is the part that is primarily invented. And ecofuturist texts are often couched within the real ramifications or results of real science. In terms of, when I say science there, I mean like what we know about the climate, what we know about the environment today. Okay. So one other thing that will really help, and I think some of the texts we're going to read are really good at this, so you'll want to be paying attention to this, is having a strong sense of likely human behavior. So thinking about sociological trends, anthropological trends, trends in history for how humans behave, both at an individual and social level, is what elevates these stories, because they become more believable when we see the things that human beings are doing, both as individuals and as groups of social creatures, within the world of the story. So when we, even if, when we can predict the human response to a particular advance, to a disaster, to an opportunity, when we have a really accurate sense of what people will do in given circumstances, and we write to that, you will have a better story. So those are some things that you might want to keep in mind as you are starting to brainstorm your ideas. One, what do you need to know about science, about biology, about climate, about ecology in order to write a story about that thing? And also, what do you need to anticipate would be believable ways that human beings, both as individuals and as social groups, socially structured groups especially, would do in response to the circumstances that your stories create? So those are just things to get the wheels turning on. You don't have to have and the last thing I want to say here from the get-go is, when we are reading your rough drafts, you don't have to have all of that figured out perfectly for these rough drafts. We will help you work out where you might need to do more homework and where you might need to think more about how people are going to act. All of this stuff is talking about what great final products do. We are certainly going to hopefully be spending some time together working through going from that rough